Next up is our session on the connected store and the future of retail. And I'd like to welcome Gwen Morrison, Evan Neufeld, and Steve Cheney. Welcome.
Thank you, everybody. Okay. Don't know if this is the best slot of the day or the worst slot of the day, depending on how much sugar was in the cookies and how long we're going to have your guys' attention. But anyway, so we are here to talk about the connected store. Is it finally happening? I do feel like this is one of these panels that maybe you could have had for a couple of years. I remember the first version of the connected store that I heard was back in Europe in the late 90s, but then it was a connected store that was based on Bluetooth and SMS. So in this panel today, this elite panel, as you notice, our tight team here, we're going to take both a look down the road at the future, but spend most of the time really focusing on what is currently happening with regards to the deployment of a connected, more interactive, immersive retail experience and beyond. So what we'd like to start doing before we introduce ourselves and get into the panel is give you folks, compliments of WPP actually, a little bit of a glimpse into the future. So if you could please cue this video and then we'll get started. Thank you very much for the folks at WPP for giving us a great glance at the future. Obviously, while there's some great velocity in there, we'll be talking about that 1% today. So my name is Evan Neufeld. I'm a principal analyst at Storyline Development. That's a consumer research consultancy. And I'd just like to briefly introduce Gwen and Steve, and they're going to give you a little bit of background on themselves and their companies in about 20 seconds. So Gwen, could you introduce yourself?
Is it on? I'm Gwen Morrison, and I'm co-CEO of The Store, which is WPP's global retail practice. And what I do is go around the world connecting the dots between innovation, great cases, some is technology related, others might be just great creative thinking around customer marketing, local marketing, or format development. And we do conferences all over the world. The video is from one we just did recently in London on the Internet of Things. And I thought that'd be a nice opener to look at how we're seeing the retail and the connected shopper at a 30,000-foot view. So that's what I do in a nutshell.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Gwen. Steve?
it was a cool video. I think they didn't really show as many retail use cases. There was like General Electric and industrial and a bunch of other crazy stuff. So this Internet of Things phenomenon, we're kind of tracking it. Estimote is from this angle of we're now walking around with like smartphones, supercomputers, and they're getting much more intelligent about predicting what we do. So we make sensors called beacons that are placed in physical environments and kind of close attribution and do cool stuff when you walk in a room or when you're on a certain aisle of like the Target department store, the aisle might kind of come to life and present you with things. I'm co-founder and sort of run business operations and finance and a bunch of other cool things in the company. Has anyone heard of Estimote?
Yeah.
Cool, a few people. Awesome.
Show of hands, how many people have actually interacted with beacons in a retail environment? Okay, we'll take that as a point of reference. So had a little confab before the conference and thought that maybe the best thing to do is talk a little bit about the different constituencies involved here. So start with the retailers, what they're doing, where they're at, talk about consumer adoption and what are drivers and inhibitors, and maybe talk a little bit even about the products that are trying to be sold through the store. So I'll just tee up this initial question. Kind of, where are we? Are we in kind of super early adopter days? Are we gathering momentum? I saw a statistic that said half of the top 100 retailers in the country are actually trying out beacons. Where do you guys think we actually are?
Well, just backing up a little bit and thinking about that store of the future and everyone being connected, I think the industry has been, in each decade almost has paid attention to different kinds of things. So I remember in the early 90s, it was that Metro store of the future in Germany, and so it was this completely tricked out store with every kind of innovation and technology that you could think of. People flocked to see this store. And at the end of the day, it wasn't particularly shopper friendly. There was the cost associated with the technology would have put most retailers out of business if you really tried to deploy all of those gadgets in a retail environment. And so then we kind of went to this next chapter, that might have even been late 80s, early 90s, next chapter, in-store media. We're deploying big screens into the store. Retail is consolidating while media is proliferating, and everyone with a plasma screen to sell or LCD, they were racing in and wiring these networks, which was somewhat misguided as well because shoppers don't really go to stores to watch television. The big TV set above the banana bin, it is where people might stop and dwell, but they're not looking at this Walmart sales associate wrapped around an actual TV way up high. And so I think we're now getting to a much more sort of almost a shopper-centric landscape where the screens are getting smaller, they're being more integrated into the aisles. I think the issue for connecting with stores, especially having to do with beacons, is that what is it that is a benefit to the shopper? And I think that's again, a lot of companies selling technology. I go to NRF every year, and it's almost hard to distinguish them, quite honestly. And I'm sure you can distinguish what you're doing. And I know you're live with some really amazing testing right now. But it has to be of benefit to the shopper. And people only 7% of purchases are online, as we know, yet we know we're using a mobile device more and more. And when I mentioned earlier, when we talked to consumers about shopping in the store, did you use technology? Remember all those screens and shopping carts? People weren't paying attention to them, but they were using their phones, and they weren't even aware of that being technology. So that technology was invisible to them, and I think that's probably the key, is how are we invisible and yet providing some kind of a benefit, whether it's value seeking, location finding, exploring, etc.
Steve, anything else?
Yeah, I mean, retail's in a fascinating place today, right? And it's not going anywhere. It's clear that we're going to walk to physical stores, the millennials, everyone's going to go to physical places and buy things. I would argue there's so much slush in the supply chain that it's justified companies like Instacart to fit in between. Imagine this is crazy, right? A truck goes across the country, it drops off a crate, someone takes that crate, puts it through the store, places it on a shelf, and you're sitting on your couch hitting a button, and someone runs to the store, picks it off the shelf, and brings it to you. It's insane, right? So retail is not going anywhere, and I think what the frame that we look through and just kind of like think about where we are in 2015, entering 2016 holidays, that we think about Estimote is, well, it's been 2 years since this iBeacon thing happened, right? And it's fascinating to think what the pull and the power that Apple has, but by putting this thing out and calling it an iDevice, calling it iBeacon, it was pretty provocative. They suggested that it was this like complete full solution that you just go drop in and it works, right? Why? Because that's what the iPhone is, that's what the iPad is. When you use an Apple product, it's perfect, it just works. And so that was not the reality. The reality was they just put something out there. They didn't tell app developers how to build apps. They didn't tell you how to calibrate it. They didn't tell retailers how to secure it so another retailer wouldn't like sniff the beacon or something like that. They didn't tell you how to manage it, scale, deploy it, all these different things. So we as a company have been sort of a platform company trying to be a little bit like Stripe is to e-commerce to make it really easy for developers to build stuff. So we think it actually hasn't been that long. It's only been like 2 years since this tech just barely came out. And the reality is it's accelerating. Like people are walking around with phones, they're logged into the physical world. And again, think about what you did before Amazon. Think about how bad the e-commerce experience was 5 years ago, even a couple years ago, right? Before you were able to shop kind of remotely from your phone. But 10 years ago, it didn't really exist. But the retail experience has not evolved at all. It's almost the exact same. So our thesis is now that's changing. People are logged in, they have a device in their hand that's super smart, understands what they want, and we can kind of in the panelists talk more about what really sophisticated companies like Target are now deploying on top of beacons and like multi-platform intelligence and stuff.
Yeah, you definitely want to get to that because it does seem like hopefully we're learning from past lessons of just throwing technology out consumers that aren't facilitating their shopping experience. To Gwen's point, I would like just for people who are not knowledgeable, talk to me about potentially other hurdles vis-a-vis price or technology with beacons. Are we at a point where those are no longer issues, or?
Yeah, part of the cost, I think, and some of the people here are interested in retail, some are just interested in like kind of local and hyper-local. And if you think about the cost of a Yelp or Yext or something, a lot of their cost is just acquiring the relationship with the merchant and then providing some service that's valuable. Beacons, as a way to close attribution and do stuff, they don't cost a lot. The device is a few dollars, and its scale, it doesn't cost a lot for Dennis Crowley to roll these out to like every merchant in New York. But the question is kind of where's the value? And to Gwen's point, there has to be something on the consumer side, like a real valuable experience, where either they're getting better ROI, selling more stuff, or monetizing through ads. And it's been a little premature to kind of close all those loops. But the technology is ready to go. It's ready for prime time. There's some things and services that need to build on top of the infrastructure to make it like complete, but it's kind of ready to go.
Yeah, but on the shopper side, it needs to be more like value for engagement. What is the payoff for me to have this kind of relationship with the brand? And so moving a little beyond specific technologies, the bigger picture of the future of retail is really to think about this convergence of content and commerce and to make things more contextually relevant. Because if you're going to deploy things like beacons, you have to have some content around that and some relevance. And again, it's either helping find something, help them explore something, find the value pricing. It has to be, a very tangible, a tangible benefit. So I guess the challenge is to kind of, if you see out to 2020 and you think about the penetration of smartphones, the fact that screens will be smaller and smaller and smaller, that a big part of the global population that will suddenly have smartphones, like today, 75% of Americans have a smartphone, but many people around the world don't. That number around globally will be 70%. So in places where people are 100% dependent on their phone to be the access point to the internet, that starts to really recast how we're thinking about content and communication and what's contextually relevant. So that's where I think it's going to be the combination of what we talked about earlier, some of the GPS type of technologies, what you're doing, but also where is the content coming from?
Yeah, and I want to definitely get to talk about some, maybe you can share anonymously otherwise, some best practices retailers, but it's interesting, we're talking through email about other examples of beacons working really well, and Gwen brought up the one of museums and cultural institutions, which I think is a good example of compelling mix of content and technology. But
I was at the Cleveland Museum of Art last weekend, and they have the most phenomenal video wall that brings the collection to life, allows you to kind of curate where you want it, what you want to see, and then with an app, it downloads what your selections are and creates the pathway. And so there's true value. This isn't interrupting my experience, it's actually enhancing it. And being a free art museum, I mean, people can go in and out, regularly, so people will spend the time to download the app and keep it on their phone. But I do think that some of the cultural institutions have done, there's been a reason, because you go into a space and suddenly the music comes alive. I don't know if anyone saw the David Bowie exhibit at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, but that was all beacon technology, highly relevant because it was bringing up the music and the narrative depending on where I was, and I, as a viewer, was in control.
Possibly a more complex fit for retail. What can you share from us by way of experiences?
Yeah, I mean, not to get too kind of out in the fringes, but the way we kind of are building a company for the long term and think about just how far technology will move in the next decade, it can be just kind of explained with a little bit of a metaphor. Remember when Uber, when you first got a ride and you just left the car without paying, right? It felt anomalous. It was a really strange feeling to feel like you could just close the door and your credit card was charged. But even back then, the driver wasn't routing based on your destination, right? They added that later and later. And now if you think about Uber as a car, a driving mechanism, or as a transportation company, the person in the car is almost like a vessel of the vehicle. They don't do anything. You walk in the car and there's a destination and they just turn the wheel. They're just there to steer the car, right? And eventually they'll go away too. So I think the way we think about this metaphor for your phone doing things like moving bits and bytes or moving goods or packages or helping you navigate as a shopper for Instacart through Whole Foods is that your devices, your screens are now kind of your first brain, like your reference point that you actually want to consult. And they have so much information that you just consult them and they tell you kind of what to do. And the question is, I think, are we going to get to that point? And some of that relies on phones being better predictors of what you want to do. And so the retail example, if you just think about that as kind of a general problem that will probably be solved. In retail, when you go to the store and you don't know how to navigate through the store, should you really just be aimlessly going through the aisle or reading these cards and thinking about where the pasta is and where the lettuce is? Or should, in theory, should the phone that you have on you just be telling you how to kind of get through the store? So, that's one thing that can help retail fight people sitting on their couch and buying from Amazon, is make the store experience better. So sophisticated companies like Target are kind of building those experiences. I would say in the frame of what's happened in retail, I will be very direct and say that most of the things that were announced in the first year or two around iBeacon were just complete BS. They were marketers that wanted to get out first, and they wanted to tell their CEO of their agency or their company or whoever it was that hey, look what we announced. And unfortunately, even big deployments that were talked about, like Macy's, effectively never really made it past a couple stores and I think a couple beacons for a couponing app. And even the Macy's thing wasn't a Macy's experience; it was Shopkick. It was a couponing experience. So in retail now, we're kind of moving, and I'll give you some use cases that we see. You open the phone up, you hit a button, and a sales associate comes to you because they know where you are in the store. You open the phone, and you see things on your shopping cart resorted depending on the aisle and the department you're at. And there's a map in the app, right? The app that you might just be using, the Target app, to buy something from your couch because you're at home sometimes. Well, when you walk into the store, it becomes an in-store mode, and there's a map, and it can help you kind of navigate through the store. So those things are now being built. It requires really granular information and context indoors, aka location coordinates. So it's obviously super complex, but we're pretty bullish on indoor location, and obviously beacons are a part of that.
But if you have to, if you're in the aisle and you have to turn on your phone to get the attention of a sales associate, you're already a little antsy. So, I kind of flip it around the other way. If it's kind of just stock up, probably you'll be fulfilling over time, with Amazon Wand and some of these other things. So you'll have to start to think differently about what's the role of the store and what kind of experience the person is looking for, and then how technology serve that situational needs state, rather than sort of old, just I'm going down this, the aisles of an 80,000 square foot box. So we don't like to think of just the store as a point of distribution. That's when it gets really boring. It's store more for discovery and experience. And I think that's the piece that when we talk about omni-channel, it's thinking about what's the role of these different tools to really solve problems. What problem are we solving? I think Macy's did learn a lot, with the backstage pass. That was a QR code. One thing they did is they trained their sales associates first, because I've been in a lot of grocery stores where I've had this little coupon or something on my phone. It's a rewards program, and the salespeople don't really know what it's about. So the education is number one for the sales associates, and then let people learn as they go. Take some risk, learn, and move on. So I know that backstage pass there is not present today, but they did a lot of learning, and it was their content. It was Tommy Hilfiger. It was their private label brands delivering content. So I'd give them a little credit for trying.
Sure, no, it's not to be negative. I think people that experiment, that's like the culture that startups foster, and that's the DNA that people want. It's amazing. You should run experiments. I think when people get ahead of themselves and they announce things like that don't ever get built, that's a little bit of it's a challenge for the industry. There's some other use cases that start to percolate up when you measure and just test, and one of them that we heard recently, which is fascinating. It was either Lowe's or Home Depot. They observed that 10% of the app opens for people that had downloaded the app were occurring inside the physical store, which is crazy, right? Because you think, well, why would you open the app up in the store? And actually, that's when people would notice, well, do they have other colors of the tile that I want for my bathroom? Or this thing weighs 200 pounds. I don't want to bring it home today. I want to leave in 5 minutes. I want to click a button, and then it'll ship to my house. So there's all kinds of use cases around pickup, distribution of goods, drop-off delivery that are starting to get really interesting, automated with both the back-end systems as well as the mobile device. The reason this stuff is, I think, slow for retail is they've traditionally had these really ugly back-end systems from legacy companies like Oracle and IBM. And whatever, they work well enough. As you guys are all aware, all this stuff's changing with Apple Pay and kind of the new payment standards. But tying those backends to iPhones and consumer devices has been hard. And some of the more sophisticated companies have embraced it. Target has iPads in the stores, their associates. Lowe's bought 40,000 iPhones for people in the store. So why? Because it would be great if you could walk in and just log into the account, or the associates were trained on the same system. And this happens over and over. Lululemon, I had a friend that recently went and wanted something that he liked because he was a loyal customer of Lululemon. It was a jacket or something. Went in the store, they didn't have it, and the associate was like, oh, cool. And I think he'd had a Lululemon account, so they just basically logged in at the store and then just shipped it to his house type thing. So I think that's how retail is going to kind of win out a little bit against Amazon, because are you really going to buy your jeans from Amazon if you can't try them on and touch them and feel them and stuff?
Yeah, so it sounds like a combination of retailers are ready. There's kind of the obvious use case about enhancing. There's other use cases that will come out of experimentation. The one thing I like just to close on, because we've got about 5 minutes left, is so you saw the show of hands of people here who've used beacons. One number I said about 56% of consumers in the U.S. know what beacons are, and of those, maybe a fourth of them have actually used them. We were actually having a little conversation about this earlier. What role do retailers or companies like yourselves play in educating consumers? Does that have to be an organic process, or can we kind of prime the pump to make this a more mainstream phenomenon sooner?
Yeah, I mean, from the respect of the technology, the truth is, right, and I think one of these little beacons is in my pocket. So they're pretty small, right? This little white thing. We have different color ones, but these are really small. They just stick on, and you sort of forget about it. But the focus shouldn't be this. It should be on the consumer experience. One time, an investor actually asked me, he's like, do you see beacons everywhere in the future? And this is a question you could ask someone like Dennis Crowley, right? He's built Foursquare. Do you see that this is going to be everywhere? And I said, I don't see it. I see it here. I see it on this screen. Meaning and I used to work in mobile in an app company before this, so I think about the UX of the experience and whatnot. If you could have accurate location information, how would the interaction change, right? Would it just reduce friction? Would it do something in one step versus four? If you you requested an Uber right now, would it know that you were here in this building and you were going to walk out front? When you walked out, something else happened. So I think that the technology will become invisible, and consumers do not need to know what beacons are. I would be deathly afraid if consumers needed to know what a beacon was in order to go shop at Target. And so the goal is to make it completely invisible and just kind of abstract the complexity from it. Now there is like, hey, I've downloaded an app, it's going to do something for me. You know, there's an opt-in permission and like location permission and whatnot that should happen, but that's the same as it's been happening when you use GPS or something else.
It's not just beacons and phones. I mean, we think about future of retail, facial recognition technology can help get the right message into the aisle to the right type of consumer. And so again, we're looking at, the reality of products on shelves, configuration of stores. Do the stores get a bit smaller if replenishment is going on a more regular basis, outside of the store? So I think we're going to see a lot of development on the shifting of formats, more technology in the store that's not simply beacon driven, but other ways that are both shopper facing and also on an operational basis more efficient for retailers who have to really tighten their operating costs and look down the road at how they can compete with pure play and other types of more disruptive retail models. Also looking internationally, you mentioned these legacy systems. There's a lot of interesting retail in other parts of the world where they kind of leapfrog. And in fact, this blew me away. I was in Soweto in 2009, and the manager of the Pick and Pay, which is a little grocery store, serving Soweto, was texting his customers about a sale on maize. This was before, remember, Sears and Walmart had kind of stumbled initially on texting their customers. But in that region, because of a lot of different factors, that was an appropriate way for him to communicate personally with them. So I always step back and say, what is this doing for us? Where is it personalization? Is it customization? What is that overarching benefit to the shopper that makes them feel that you know them, just like in the old days when you went into the general store and the guy said, hello, I know you, we have your new product. So that's that, you've all seen that Back to the Future, that typified in today's retail environment. And I bring that up because the Cubs are playing tonight. So and the Mets are playing tonight.
Yay. I think we're going to see, I don't know how successful this has been, but thank you guys for that great answer. And my summary statement would be, challenging times continue for retailers, lots of upside, but business fundamentally evolving. Got to get beyond the point where we're making shopping better. It's going to evolve to this new place. Curious if anyone in the audience has any questions they'd like to ask our esteemed panel. Yes, over there. You have a mic right there.
Hi, I'm Sherry Donnemeyer from Burrell Associates. Street Fight, in the beginning, they were presenting a survey they had done that said a number of things that we're not going to be talking about next year. One of them was beacons.
Next year?
Right, 2016.
Yeah, they did present.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's exactly right. We shouldn't be obsessing over like shiny objects. We should just be building the foundation of like of actually what's like helpful. It's fascinating to watch the more sophisticated people behind the scenes build now. We're growing pretty quickly as a company. We have 50 people now, huge software team, tons of customers.
So you'd be saying we're not going to talk about it, we're just going to do it. That's what your point is.
65% of the Fortune 100 are paying customers of us, so there's a lot of people building this stuff. And make no mistake, it's not about just a beacon. The beacon is just, we think, probably an elegant way. It's Bluetooth Low Energy to kind of do some of these things in the background. But Bluetooth is actually, low energy, is the fastest growing physical interface in the history of mobile in the world. It's faster growing than Wi-Fi and 3G and LTE. So it's actually, I think, accelerating, but I'm really happy when I don't get invited to brain dump meetings to evangelize beacons. It was just a disaster in 2013 and 2014. Yeah.
Okay, and I think that's all we have time for?
Thank you.
Yes, no? Okay. We have time for another question, maybe? Okay, right there. Did you raise your hand, sir? Yeah. Okay.
I actually used to be at Target, and I'm just curious, from Steve, as far as beacons go, once these deploy into these big box retailers, or the Fortune 50 or the Fortune 100, how quick are they able to really react to the data they're collecting and kind of deploy that properly and sort of act nimbly within their internal organizations? Do you have exposure to seeing, the back end, I guess, of this data, or are you sort of really seeing more the front end of just beacon adoption, not necessarily how that data is being acted on within these organizations?
It's a great question.
Were you in Minneapolis?
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So, Target headquarters is a special place. Like as a company, they have a strong DNA in marketing, and they built a really good technology foundation. So what we see them doing is salivating over the data, right? So they announced publicly in August that they went live with like a huge pilot and want to go to all of their stores, which is 1,800, as quick as they can, ideally by Christmas. And in the data collection phase now, we're starting to see things, right? Like, well, how long do people stay in certain aisles of the store? And just let's think about this from a very basic perspective, right? When you're logged into eBay, which pioneered a lot of this stuff, eBay knows what you want to buy, right? They know you're on the electronics section or you're going to buy a doll. Physical stores have no idea about that. And so what we'd love to do is for them to have that data so that, to Gwen's point, they can make the consumer experience much better. The challenge with analytics and a lot of these things that were false starts around retail is they were just oriented around collecting data without like any consumer benefit, right? But if you dwell in a certain area of the store, or you go in another area, or you pause by the patio furniture, it might be a signal to the store that like, well, you want to buy patio furniture. And that's the kind of stuff that, from the data perspective, will eventually completely change the industry. Why? Because it doesn't take very many basis points of increases in sales or efficiency to kind of completely change the top line or the bottom line of the retailers.
Yeah, just a whole nother slice of that is, I don't know if anyone was at NRF last January, but there was a lot of buzz about that Rebecca Minkoff store and the kind of this digitized environment where you'd have the retailer would know what garments were in the dressing room. We only know what garments you've purchased typically. But let's say someone always likes to try on that size 6 along with the size 8, and they bring in the blue and the black, but they always buy the black. It would help a sales associate. This is on a higher end, retail environment, more customized boutique experience, to be able to allocate that time best to set a dressing room the way customized to the shopper needs and wants. So there's all kinds of data pointers. The other, we talked about not wanting to buy a pair of jeans on Amazon, and that's why you have Pointer now as an experimental type of digital experience. Just there's different categories. There's different kinds of innovations. So I wouldn't say there's a one size fits all. I think it's what problem are you solving? Okay.
I think perhaps next year we can have a panel about what retailers are doing with the beacon data they're actually gathering. So
yeah, I mean, next year there's going to be tons of measurements. Again, like you're talking about 2 years in a kind of a long-term cycle. So it'll be fun to kind of talk more about like how it's helping people, and that I think ultimately will drive more adoption.
And with that, we have to wrap. Thank you very much. Thank my great panelists, and they'll be around, so feel free to harass them on a one-on-one basis. Thank you.